History records the victories of generals, but it forgets the sacrifices of ordinary men. Arthur Sterling was no soldier. He was a father pushed too far by tyranny. From the freezing starvation of Valley Forge to the heartbreaking betrayal of his best friend in the dark woods of Morristown, Arthur's journey is the untold heartbeat of the Revolution. He traded his quiet life in Boston for a musket, risking everything for a dream that seemed impossible. Witness the saga of sacrifice, resilience, and the crimson dawn of liberty. This is not just a story of war. It is the painful birth of a nation. If you love immersive historical stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Close your eyes, relax, and let's step back into history. The bitter wind swept across the dark waters of Boston Harbor, carrying with it the salty tang of the sea and the heavier, unmistakable scent of unrest. Arthur Sterling stood in the shadow of a weathered warehouse, his breath forming jagged clouds in the freezing air, as he watched the patrol of redcoats march past, with their muskets resting casually on their shoulders, a sight that had once inspired fear, but now only kindled a deep and smoldering rage within his chest. The city of Boston was a powder keg, waiting for a spark, and Arthur knew that he was standing on the fuse. For too long the streets he had grown up in had echoed with the boots of foreign soldiers and the harsh commands of a distant king who saw these colonies not as a home for free men, but as a purse to be plundered. Arthur adjusted the heavy woolen scarf around his neck and stepped out from the shadows, only when the rhythm of the soldiers' boots had faded into the distance. His own footsteps were silent on the damp cobblestones, a skill he had mastered over the last few months of delivering messages that could get a man hanged. The moon was obscured by a thick blanket of clouds, turning the night into a canvas of grays and blacks, fitting for the mood that hung over the populace like a funeral shroud. He made his way toward the Green Dragon Tavern, the heart of the resistance, where the air was always thick with smoke and treason. But tonight, he was not heading for a drink. He was heading for a decision that would alter the course of his life, and perhaps the fate of this new world. As he walked, he passed the darkened windows of shops that had been closed due to the boycotts, their empty displays a testament to the stubborn will of the people who refused to pay taxes on goods they had no say in governing. Arthur remembered his father's printing press, now silent and covered in dust, because the stamp duties had made it impossible to operate, and the memory tightened his jaw with a fresh wave of bitterness. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a stray dog that skittered away into the alley, the sudden movement making his heart jump. Nerves were frayed all across the city, and every shadow seemed to hold a spy or an informant loyal to the crown. Reaching the heavy oak door of the tavern, he paused to compose himself, smoothing the rough fabric of his coat and taking a deep, steadying breath before pushing his way inside. The warmth of the room hit him instantly, carrying the smell of roasted meat and ale. But beneath the jovial noise of the patrons, there was an undercurrent of serious intent. Arthur caught the eye of a man sitting near the hearth, a man with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much war, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. Arthur moved through the crowd, ignoring the inquisitive glances of strangers, and slipped through a back door that led to the cellar where the real business of the night was to take place. The cellar was dimly lit by a few flickering candles, casting long dancing shadows against the stone walls, and around a rough wooden table sat a dozen men, their faces grim and illuminated by the wavering light. These were the sons of liberty, men who had traded the comfort of obedience for the dangerous path of rebellion. They looked up as Arthur entered, and the room fell silent, the weight of their collective expectations settling on his shoulders. A map was spread out on the table, marked with the positions of the British ships, the Dartmouth, the Aliner, and the Beaver, which sat heavy in the harbor laden with the hated tea. The leader of the group, a fiery orator named Samuel, pointed a stained finger at the map and spoke in a voice that was low but vibrated with intensity, telling them that the time for petitions and pleas was over, and that action was the only language the tyrant would understand. Arthur listened, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs, as the plan was laid out in stark detail. They were to disguise themselves as Mohawks to hide their identities and to symbolize their distinct American spirit. They would board the ships under the cover of darkness and cast the cargo into the sea. It was a mad plan, a desperate act of defiance that could bring the full might of the British Empire crashing down upon their heads. But as Arthur looked at the faces around the table, he saw no fear, only a steely resolve that mirrored his own. He thought of the future, of the children he hoped to have one day, and he wondered if they would grow up as subjects or as citizens. That single thought was enough to steel his nerves. He stepped forward into the light and placed his hand on the table, his voice steady as he pledged his allegiance to the cause, stating clearly that he would rather drown in that harbor than live another day on his knees. The meeting broke up hours later and Arthur found himself back out in the cold night. But the air no longer felt biting. It felt electric with potential. He walked back toward the waterfront, drawn by a strange force to look upon the ships one last time before the night of reckoning. The masts rose like skeletons against the sky, silent witnesses to the history that was about to be written. The water lapped gently against the hull of the Dartmouth, a soothing sound that belied the violence to come. Arthur stood on the edge of the wharf, the smell of brine filling his nostrils, and he knew that there was no turning back now. The die was cast and the crimson dawn was approaching. He turned away from the sea and headed home, his steps lighter now, driven by a purpose that was greater than fear, greater than safety, greater than life itself. The shadows over Boston Harbor were deep and dark, but in the heart of Arthur Sterling, a fire had been lit that no ocean could extinguish, a fire that would burn until it consumed the old world and forged a new one in its ashes. The 16th of December dawned with a cold gray light that seemed to leach the color from the world, leaving behind a stark landscape of frozen mud and anxious faces. Arthur Sterling woke with a knot of dread tight in his stomach, a physical manifestation of the day's immense significance, because today was the deadline, the day the tea ships must either unload their cargo or face confiscation, and the Patriots had vowed that neither would happen. Arthur dressed in silence, his movements mechanical as he pulled on his breeches and heavy shirt. His mind was already miles away at the Old South Meeting House, where the town was gathering to hear the final verdict from the governor. He stepped out into the biting wind, the streets already alive with a nervous energy that was distinct from the usual bustle of commerce. Men walked with their heads down, but their eyes were wide and darting, seeking out allies and watching for the soldiers who patrolled with increased vigilance. Arthur made his way through the winding streets, joining the stream of citizens flowing toward the meeting house. The crowd was massive, thousands of people pressing shoulder to shoulder, a sea of tricorn hats and woolen bonnets, all turned toward the pulpit, where the leaders of the resistance stood grim and resolute. The air inside was hot and stifling, smelling of damp wool and unwashed bodies, and the collective breath of a population pushed to the brink. Arthur found a spot near the back, leaning against a rough wooden pillar, his eyes fixed on Samuel Adams, who stood like a statue of judgment, his face illuminated by the pale light filtering through the high windows. Hours passed in a blur of speeches and legal arguments, a slow, agonizing wait for the return of the messenger who had been sent to the governor's country, a state to beg for a peaceful resolution. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the crowded hall, the messenger returned with the news they had all feared but expected. The governor would not yield, the ships would not be allowed to leave, and the tea would be landed by force if necessary. A silence fell over the room, a heavy, suffocating silence that lasted only a heartbeat before Samuel Adams stood tall and spoke the words that would change history, declaring that this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. It was the signal they had been waiting for, a war cry disguised as a resignation. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline that banished the cold and the fear. He slipped out of the side door with a group of predetermined men, moving quickly through the darkening streets toward the designated meeting point at a blacksmith's shop near the waterfront. Inside the shop, the air was thick with the smell of coal dust and sweat. Men were stripping off their coats and smearing their faces with soot and red paint, transforming themselves into Mohawk warriors. A disguise meant not to deceive the British, who knew well enough who they were, but to hide their individual identities from the law, and to proclaim that they were no longer subjects of England, but something new and wild and free. Arthur took a handful of the black dust and rubbed it over his cheeks and forehead, his blue eyes shining stark and bright against the blackened skin. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and grabbed a hatchet, its handle worn smooth by years of honest labor now repurposed for an act of treason. They moved out in a column, marching 2 by 2 in a disciplined silence that was more terrifying than any mob's roar. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of their boots on the frozen ground and the distant whistle of the wind through the rigging of the ships. When they reached Griffin's Wharf, the 3 ships loomed large and silent in the harbor, their lanterns swaying gently with the tide. The Dartmouth, the Aliner, and the Beaver were unguarded save for a few terrified sailors, who wisely stepped aside as the wave of disguised men poured onto the decks. Arthur found himself on the deck of the Dartmouth, the wood slick with frost under his feet. He looked around at his companion's men. He had known all his life, now rendered unrecognizable by the night and the paint. They worked with a terrifying efficiency, hoisting the heavy crates of tea from the hold and bringing them to the rail. The sound of hatchets biting into wood echoed across the water, a sharp, rhythmic cracking that sounded like gunfire in the quiet night. Arthur swung his axe with a savage intensity, splitting the lid of a chest and revealing the black leaves inside. The smell of the tea was overpowering, a fragrant floral scent that clashed violently with the smell of the harbor mud and the sweat of their labor. He tipped the crate over the side, watching the dark leaves cascade into the water, swirling and mixing with the tide. It was a destruction of property, a wanton waste that would have horrified him a year ago, but tonight it felt like a holy sacrament, a purging of the chains that bound them. Below on the wharf, a crowd had gathered, watching in a stunned silence. There were no cheers, no riots, just the steady sound of destruction and the splash of crates hitting the water. Arthur worked until his arms burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps, his sweat streaking the soot on his face. He paused for a moment, leaning on his hatchet, and looked out toward the harbor mouth, where the British warships lay at anchor. Their cannons were silent, their admirals perhaps too stunned by the audacity of the act to react. Or perhaps they simply could not believe that a group of merchants and farmers would dare to defy the might of the empire so openly. The moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale light on the scene, illuminating the water, which was now black with tea. The tide was low, and the piles of tea leaves rose like islands in the shallow water, preventing the crates from sinking. So Arthur and the others climbed down into the mud, beating the piles with their oars and boots, ensuring that every last leaf was ruined, soaked in the salt water that was the lifeblood of this city. It took 3 hours to empty the ships, 3 hours of backbreaking labor that stripped away the fear and replaced it with a cold, hard resolve. As the last crate was smashed and thrown overboard, a strange calm settled over Arthur. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of black across his brow, and looked at the men around him. They were panting, dirty and exhausted, but in their eyes he saw the same spark that burned in his own, the spark of rebellion that had finally caught fire. They formed their ranks again on the wharf, the adrenaline fading to leave a bone-deep weariness. A fife player began to play a jaunty tune, a final act of defiance as they marched back through the city, passing the house of the British admiral, who watched them from an upstairs window. Arthur looked up as they passed, and though he could not see the admiral's face, he could feel the weight of his stare. A stare that promised retribution, promised war, promised that the streets of Boston would run red before this was over. But as Arthur walked back to his home, slipping through the shadows to wash the paint from his face and burn his clothes, he felt no regret, only a grim satisfaction. He knew that tomorrow everything would be different. The port would be closed, the soldiers would come in force, and life as they knew it would end. But the choice had been made. The tea was in the harbor, and the king had his answer. Arthur Sterling scrubbed his face until his skin was raw, watching the black water swirl down the drain, carrying away the disguise, but leaving the rebel underneath. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside, and knowing that the storm had finally broken. The spark had been struck, and now they would all have to live in the fire. The ink in the well was as black and still as the heavy silence that filled the small room. Arthur Sterling sat at the scarred oak table, his hand trembling slightly, not from the biting cold that seeped through the cracks in the window frame, but from the sheer weight of the words he was struggling to find. The candle flame flickered, casting long dancing shadows against the wall's shadows that seemed to mock his hesitation. Upstairs he could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of his wife Eliza and their young son Thomas, a sound that usually brought him a profound sense of peace, but tonight tore at his heart like a serrated blade. It had been 3 months since the tea was thrown into the harbor, 3 months since the city of Boston had been turned into a prison by the king's vengeance. The port was closed, the ships lay rotting at their anchors, and the British soldiers patrolled the streets with an arrogance that turned the stomach of every free man. Arthur dipped the quill into the ink, the scratch of the nib against the glass sounding loud in the quiet house. He knew that by sunrise he would be gone, slipping out of the city to join the gathering militias in the countryside, where the true resistance was forming. He could not say goodbye to them face to face. He could not bear the tears in Eliza's eyes or the confusion in his son's face. So he had chosen the coward's courage of a letter, a piece of paper, to explain why a father would abandon his family to fight for a concept as abstract as liberty. He pressed the pen to the parchment, and the words began to flow, not easily, but with a painful necessity. "My dearest Eliza," he wrote, "forgive me for the silence in which I leave you, but know that my heart breaks with every step I take away from this house." He paused, looking around the room, his eyes resting on the familiar objects of their life together. The hearth where they had sat on winter evenings, the shelf of books he hoped Thomas would one day read, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters smelling of rosemary and thyme. Everything spoke of a life of quiet domesticity, a life that was now being crushed under the boot of tyranny. He continued writing, "You know as well as I that the air in Boston has become poisonous, not with plague, but with oppression. The soldiers on the corner, the laws that strip us of our rights, the hunger that gnaws at the bellies of the poor. I cannot stand by and watch our world shrink until we are nothing but slaves in our own land." He remembered the incident last week, when a redcoat had shoved an old woman into the mud for not moving fast enough. The rage he had felt then was a cold, hard thing that had settled in his marrow. "I go not because I love war," he wrote, the ink staining his fingers, "but because I love peace too much to see it bought at the price of our souls. I go to secure a future where Thomas can grow up to be a man who bows to no king but his conscience." The wind rattled the window pane, a mournful sound that seemed to echo his own sorrow. He imagined the road ahead, the long march to Concord, the uncertainty of sleeping in the rough, the very real possibility that he would never see this room or these people again. That thought stopped his hand, and a drop of ink fell onto the paper, spreading like a dark bloodstain. He stared at it for a moment, mesmerized by the finality of it. He thought of his father who had built this house, who had taught him that a man's worth is measured by what he is willing to defend. Surely his father would understand. Surely he would see that this rebellion was the natural heir to the hard work of building a colony in the wilderness. Arthur wiped the nib and continued, "Do not fear for me, my love, for I carry your image in my heart as a shield against the darkness. If I fall, knowing that my last thought was of you and the sunlight in your hair." He described where he had hidden the small amount of coin they had left beneath the loose floorboard in the pantry. Instructions on how to barter for flour with the miller, who was a patriot sympathizer. Practical details that felt absurdly mundane against the backdrop of impending war, yet were vital for their survival. The candle was burning low, the wax dripping onto the holder in slow tear like rivulets. Arthur knew he had to finish soon. The sky to the east would be graying within the hour, and the patrols were lightest just before dawn. He signed his name at the bottom of the page simply Arthur, a name that had once belonged to a printer, a husband, a father, but now belonged to a soldier of a nation that did not yet exist. He folded the paper carefully, his fingers lingering on the texture of the parchment, sealing it with a drop of red wax that looked stark and violent in the dim light. He stood up the chair, scraping softly against the floor, and walked to the mantelpiece, propping the letter against the small clock that ticked away the seconds of their remaining time together. He went to the door where his pack was already waiting, containing a blanket, a flask of water, some dried meat, and his musket wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp. He put on his coat, the wool rough against his neck, and picked up his hat. But he could not leave just yet, not without one last look. He crept up the stairs, the wood groaning softly under his weight, and pushed open the door to the bedroom. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating Eliza's face, soft in sleep, her hand resting protectively over Thomas, who was curled up beside her. Arthur stood in the doorway for a long moment, memorizing the rise and fall of their chests, the way Eliza's hair fanned out across the pillow, the peaceful innocence of his son's sleeping face. Tears pricked at his eyes, hot and stinging, but he refused to let them fall. He blew a silent kiss into the room, a prayer and a promise woven into the air. Then he turned and walked away, his heart heavy as a stone in his chest. He descended the stairs and stepped out into the cool night air, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch felt like the closing of a book at the end of a chapter. The street was empty and silent, shrouded in mist. Arthur adjusted the pack on his shoulder and gripped his musket tight, feeling the cold iron through the cloth. He did not look back at the house he could not bear to. Instead, he fixed his eyes on the road ahead, the road that led out of Boston, past the British sentries and into the unknown. As he walked, the letter sat on the mantelpiece, a silent sentinel waiting for the dawn, waiting to deliver its message of love and sacrifice, waiting to break a heart in order to save a country. And Arthur Sterling walked on into the shadows, leaving his life behind, to find his destiny in the smoke and fire of the revolution that was rising like a crimson tide. The wind howled across the frozen fields of Valley Forge, like a banshee screaming for the souls of the dead. Arthur Sterling pulled his tattered blanket tighter around his shoulders, but the cold was a living thing, a relentless predator that gnawed at his bones and settled deep in his marrow where no fire could reach. It was the winter of 1777, a season that would be etched into their memories, not for battles fought with muskets and cannons, but for the silent, agonizing war against hunger and frostbite. The optimism of the early days, the fiery speeches of liberty, and the adrenaline of Lexington seemed like a distant dream now, a story told by someone else in a different life. Arthur looked around the cramped log hut that he shared with 11 other men. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of green wood that refused to burn properly, and the stench of sickness that clung to the damp earth floor. Men lay huddled together for warmth, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes staring blankly at the rough timber roof, as if searching for a god who had seemingly abandoned them to this white hell. Next to Arthur lay young William, a boy of no more than 18, who had joined the army with visions of glory and blue uniforms, but now lay shivering with a fever that turned his skin the color of old parchment. Arthur reached out and dipped a rag into a bucket of water that had a layer of ice cracking on its surface, and gently wiped the boy's forehead. William murmured a name in his delirium, perhaps his mother or a sweetheart back in Virginia, and the sound tore at Arthur's heart, because he knew that William would likely never see another spring. Outside the hut, the snow lay deep and pristine, a cruel beauty that hid the bloody footprints of men who had no shoes. Arthur looked down at his own feet, wrapped in strips of burlap sacking the leather of his boots, long since worn away by the endless marches. His toes were numb, devoid of feeling, which was a blessing and a curse, for when the feeling returned, it came with a burning agony that made grown men weep. He crawled toward the door and pushed it open just a crack. The blast of Arctic air hit him instantly, freezing the moisture in his nose and making his eyes water. He looked out at the camp, a sprawling city of misery where thousands of huts smoked in the gray light of dawn. Sentry fires flickered in the distance where men stood guard against a British attack that would likely never come, for the British were warm and well-fed in Philadelphia, enjoying balls and banquets, while the Continental Army slowly starved just 20 miles away. The injustice of it burned in Arthur's gut hotter than the meager fire. He thought of the Congress bickering in safety, while they begged for food and blankets, only to be met with empty promises and bureaucratic delays. A figure walked past in the distance, wrapped in a heavy blue cloak, riding a white horse that looked as weary as the men. It was General Washington, the man who held this ragtag army together by the sheer force of his will. Arthur watched him ride slowly through the lines, stopping to speak to a group of soldiers huddled around a pot of boiling water that contained nothing but melted snow and a few stones to trick the stomach. Seeing the general gave Arthur a flicker of strength, a reminder that they were not entirely leaderless, that there was one man who shared their suffering and refused to break. Arthur closed the door and moved back to the fire, taking a piece of fire cake from his pocket, a hard, tasteless lump of flour and water baked on a hot stone. He broke it in half and offered a piece to William, but the boy turned his head away, too weak to eat. Arthur chewed the dry bread, slowly trying to make it last, trying to convince his body that it was nourishment. His mind drifted back to the letter he had left on the mantelpiece so many months ago. He wondered if Eliza had read it, if she understood why he was here freezing in the Pennsylvania wilderness, instead of sitting by her side. The memory of her face was starting to fade at the edges, worn down by the constant struggle for survival, and that terrified him more than the British bayonets. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to conjure the smell of her hair, the sound of her laugh, but all he could smell was wood smoke and gangrene, and all he could hear was the wind and the coughing of dying men. A soldier in the corner named Silas began to sing a hymn, his voice cracked and raspy, but holding a defiant tune. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. One by one other voices joined in a low, mournful chorus that rose above the sound of the wind. Arthur found himself humming along the vibrations in his chest, loosening the tightness of despair. It was a strange thing, this brotherhood of misery. These men who had nothing left to give, but their lives were bound together by a cord stronger than iron. They fought not for pay, for they had none, not for glory, for there was none to be found here, but for each other, and for the stubborn refusal to let the dream die in the snow. As the song faded, a silence returned, but it was less heavy than before. Arthur checked William again, and felt a faint pulse, a tiny drumbeat of life that refused to surrender. He adjusted the blanket, tucking it around the boy's shoulders, and whispered a promise that they would see the spring together, that they would walk out of this valley and march on to victory. The day dragged on, a slow procession of gray hours, marked only by the changing of the guard and the burial details that moved like ghosts toward the edge of the camp. The ground was frozen so hard that graves could barely be dug, so the dead were covered in snow until the thaw. A final indignity for men who had given everything. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further, the logs of the hut cracking with the cold. Arthur took his turn at the fire, feeding it the last few sticks of wood they had gathered. He watched the flames dance and realized that this winter was the forge, the fire that would burn away the impurities and leave only the steel. If they survived this, if they could endure the unendurable, then no army on earth could defeat them. He looked at his hands, scarred and dirty, and saw not the hands of a printer but the hands of a soldier, a survivor. He closed his eyes and let the exhaustion take him, drifting into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of ice and fire. But deep down in the frozen landscape of his soul, a small ember continued to glow, the ember of hope, the belief that even the longest winter must eventually yield to the sun. And Arthur Sterling held onto that ember with a desperate grip, determined to keep it burning until the morning light returned to the world. The transition from the frozen, silent purgatory of Valley Forge to the bustling, opulent streets of occupied Philadelphia was a shock to the senses that left Arthur Sterling reeling as if he had stepped through a mirror into a twisted alternate reality. He walked slowly, guiding a cart laden with firewood, his breath misting in the air. But unlike the desperate, shivering cold of the camp, the air here smelled of roasted meats and wood smoke, and the rich perfume of ladies who had never known a day of hunger. Arthur kept his head low, his hat pulled down to obscure his eyes, which he knew betrayed too much intelligence and too much hatred for a simple woodcutter. He was deep behind enemy lines, walking into the very lion's den, where General Howe and his officers feasted, while the Continental Army slowly died of starvation just 20 miles away. The cobblestones were slick with slush, churned up by the wheels of carriages, and the boots of British patrols who marched with an air of invincible arrogance, their red coats bright splashes of blood against the winter gray. Arthur felt the pistol hidden beneath his rough spun tunic, a heavy cold weight against his ribs, a reminder that one wrong look, one slip of the tongue would mean a hangman's noose before sunset. He made his way toward the Golden Fleece Tavern, a known haunt of loyalists and off-duty officers, where the wine flowed freely and loose tongues often spilled secrets that were worth more than gold. His contact was a serving girl named Martha, a shadow in the corner of the room who saw everything and said nothing. But reaching her meant navigating a gauntlet of suspicion. He tied his horse to the post outside, patting the beast's flank with a trembling hand, and pushed open the heavy oak door. The wave of heat and noise that hit him was physical, a wall of laughter and clinking glass, and the drone of confident voices discussing the war as if it were a game of cricket. Arthur moved to the bar, ordering a tankard of ale with a coin he could ill afford to spend. He found a table in the dim light near the hearth, trying to make himself small, trying to become just another piece of the furniture. His eyes scanned the room over the rim of his mug, watching the officers in their pristine uniforms, their faces flushed with drink and warmth. He saw Martha moving through the crowd, carrying a tray of roast fowl, her face a mask of subservience. She caught his eye for a fraction of a second, a signal so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. She moved toward a table occupied by 3 high-ranking officers, who were leaning in close, their voices lowered in conspiracy. Arthur shifted in his seat, straining his ears against the din of the tavern. He needed to get closer, but moving without cause would draw attention. Luck, or perhaps Providence, intervened as a drunken merchant stumbled from a nearby stool, leaving a vacancy just behind the officer's table. Arthur seized the moment, moving with the slow, deliberate movements of a tired laborer, and took his seat back to the officers, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The officers were speaking of a supply train, a massive convoy of munitions and winter clothing arriving from New York within the week, intended to bolster the British hold on the city and prepare for a spring offensive that would crush the rebellion once and for all. The details were specific: the route, the guard's strength, the timing. It was the kind of intelligence that could turn the tide of the war, that could give Washington the chance to strike a blow that would ring across the colonies. Arthur memorized every word, etching the details into his mind, alongside the map of the roads he knew so well. But then the conversation shifted, and his blood ran cold. One of the officers, a man with a sharp, nasally voice, began to speak of a spy within their midst, a leak that they had traced to this very district. Arthur stiffened his hand, instinctively moving toward his pistol, but he forced himself to remain still to take a sip of his ale, though it tasted like ash in his mouth. Martha approached the table to refill their wine glasses, and as she poured, she stumbled, slightly spilling a drop of red wine onto the sleeve of the sharp-voiced officer. He roared in anger, rising to his feet and striking her across the face, a sound that silenced the room. Arthur's knuckles turned white as he gripped the table, his instinct to protect her warring with the mission. He watched as she apologized profusely, her eyes downcast, but as she backed away, she brushed past Arthur, and he felt a small folded piece of paper slip into his hand. It was done. He had the confirmation he needed, but now the room felt dangerous, the air charged with a sudden violence. The officer was still shouting, looking around the room for someone to vent his fury upon, and his eyes landed on Arthur, the solitary figure in the rough clothes. He demanded to know what a peasant was doing in a place for gentlemen, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Arthur stood up slowly, feigning a drunken sway, realizing that he had to play the fool to survive. He mumbled an apology in a slurred voice, bowing low and scraping his boots on the floor, acting the part of the terrified serf. The officer sneered, looking at him with pure disgust, and waved him away dismissively, telling him to get back to the mud where he belonged. Arthur stumbled toward the door, his heart in his throat, feeling the eyes of the room boring into his back. He pushed out into the cold night air, and the relief was so intense it almost made him dizzy. But he knew he wasn't safe yet, not until he was miles away from these cobblestones. He untied his horse and climbed onto the cart, urging the animal forward with a slap of the reins. He navigated the streets with a new urgency, the firewood in the back now just a cover for the burning secret he carried. As he reached the city limits, the sentries stopped him, their lanterns swinging in the darkness, casting long shadows across the snow. They asked for his papers, their breath smelling of gin. Arthur handed them the forged documents, his hand steady despite the fear that coiled in his gut. The guard scrutinized the papers for a long, agonizing minute, then looked at the firewood and asked if he had any brandy hidden beneath the logs. Arthur forced a laugh and said he wished he did. The guard grunted and waved at him, through opening the gate that stood between captivity and freedom. As the cart rolled out into the open country, the noise of the city fading behind him, Arthur finally let out the breath he had been holding. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the note Martha had given him. By the light of the moon, he read the hasty scrawl that confirmed the time of the supply train's arrival. He looked back at the glow of Philadelphia on the horizon, a city of light and luxury built on a foundation of tyranny, and whispered a silent thank you to the brave girl who remained behind in the lion's den. The road ahead was dark and treacherous, the wind picking up again, promising more snow, but Arthur did not feel the cold. He felt a fire burning within him, the fire of purpose. He had walked into the enemy camp and stolen their secrets, and now he was bringing a weapon back to General Washington, a weapon made of information that would help them survive the winter and perhaps, just perhaps, win the war. He urged the horse into a trot, the cart bouncing over the frozen ruts, the sound of the wheels like a drumbeat in the night. He was no longer just a soldier or a husband or a father. He was a ghost in the machine of the empire, a whisper in the dark that would turn into a scream of liberty. The miles fell away, and as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Arthur saw the smoke of the American camp fires rising in the distance. It was a grim and desolate sight, but to him it was the most beautiful thing in the world. It was home. It was the forge of the future, and he was returning with the fuel to keep the fire alive. The night of December 25th descended upon the banks of the Delaware River, not as a silent peace, but as a violent, chaotic fury. A nor'easter storm whipped the snow into blinding sheets that stung the skin like needles, and the wind howled with a demonic voice that drowned out the orders of the officers and the frightened whinnies of the horses. Arthur Sterling stood by the water's edge, his boots sinking deep into the freezing mud, his body trembling uncontrollably from a cold that seemed to originate from the very center of the earth. He watched the dark, churning water of the river, where massive, jagged plates of ice crashed against each other with the sound of grinding bones, a terrifying cacophony that promised death to anyone foolish enough to challenge the current. But tonight they had no choice. Tonight was the gamble, the final desperate throw of the dice that General Washington had decided upon, and Arthur knew that if they did not cross this river, if they did not strike the Hessians at Trenton before dawn, the revolution would die here in the snow, strangled by its own weakness. He adjusted the heavy pack on his back and gripped his musket with numb fingers, checking for the 100th time that the lock was covered by his rag to keep the powder dry. Around him, the scene was one of organized chaos. Men were struggling to load cannons onto the high-sided Durham boats, the heavy iron guns threatening to capsize the fragile vessels before they even left the shore. Colonel Knox's booming voice cut through the storm, bellowing orders to the men, his presence a beacon of stability in the swirling madness. Arthur found himself ushered toward one of the boats by a sergeant whose face was wrapped in a scarf, leaving only his eyes visible, eyes that were wide with the same mixture of fear and determination that Arthur felt in his own heart. He climbed over the gunwale, the boat rocking perilously under his weight, and found a space between a shivering drummer boy and a grim-faced rifleman from Virginia. The boat was overcrowded, the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies pungent even in the freezing air. But there was a comfort in the proximity, a shared warmth that was the only defense against the storm. As the boat pushed off from the bank, the current grabbed it instantly, twisting it sideways, and for a heart-stopping moment Arthur thought they would capsize, throwing them all into the black freezing water, where survival time was measured in seconds. The oarsmen groaned with effort, pulling against the heavy sweep of the river, their muscles straining as they navigated through the obstacle course of ice floes. A massive chunk of ice struck the side of the boat with a deafening crack, sending a spray of freezing water over the men who huddled in the bottom. Arthur gasped as the icy water soaked through his coat, shocking his skin. But he did not move, he did not cry out. He simply stared ahead into the darkness, trying to see the opposite shore, trying to see the future that lay waiting in the mist. In the boat ahead of them, illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern, stood the tall, imposing figure of General Washington, wrapped in his heavy cloak, staring forward with an unblinking gaze. Seeing him there so calm amidst the tempest gave Arthur a surge of courage. If the general believed they could make it, then perhaps they could. Perhaps this madness was actually genius in disguise. The crossing seemed to take an eternity, hours stretching out in the darkness while the storm raged on relentlessly. The snow turned to sleet, coating everything in a layer of ice that made the ropes slick and the floorboards treacherous. Arthur's hands were so cold he could no longer feel his fingers. He wondered if he would ever be able to pull a trigger again if the time came. He thought of the fire back in his home, of the warmth of his bed. But he pushed those thoughts away, knowing they were dangerous, knowing they could lull him into a sleep from which he would never wake. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the keel of the boat scraped against the gravel of the Jersey shore, a sound more beautiful than any symphony. Men scrambled out into the shallow water, slipping and falling on the icy rocks, dragging the cannons and the horses up the steep, muddy bank. They had made it. They had crossed the impossible river, but the ordeal was far from over. They were now 9 miles from Trenton, and the storm was worsening, turning the road into a sheet of ice. The army formed up in the darkness, a long column of shivering ghosts. The password for the night was whispered down the line: victory or death, a phrase that summed up their reality with a brutal simplicity. Arthur marched, his feet moving rhythmically, more from muscle memory than conscious thought. His boots were falling apart, the blood from his cut feet leaving red stains on the pristine snow, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The wind blew directly into their faces, driving the sleet into their eyes, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Men collapsed by the side of the road, overcome by exhaustion and the cold, and were prodded back to their feet by officers who knew that to stop was to die. Arthur helped the drummer boy, who stumbled beside him, pulling the lad up by his arm and whispering words of encouragement that the wind tore away before they could be heard. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the sky, they were still marching, the element of surprise, their only weapon. The muskets were wet, useless clubs in their hands, so the order was passed down to use the bayonet, to resolve the issue with cold steel. Arthur fixed his bayonet, his hands fumbling with the metal, the click of the locking mechanism sounding loud in the quiet morning. They reached the outskirts of the town just as the sun tried to break through the storm clouds. The Hessian sentries shouted in alarm, a guttural cry that was cut short by the crack of a rifle. And then chaos erupted. Arthur ran forward, his fatigue forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that sharpened his senses. He saw the sleepy, confused faces of the mercenaries, tumbling out of their quarters, trying to form ranks in the street. He heard the boom of Knox's cannons firing grapeshot down the narrow avenues, tearing through the enemy lines. It was a whirlwind of noise and smoke and violence. Arthur found himself in the thick of it, parrying a bayonet thrust from a tall Hessian soldier, and countering with a strike of his own. The man fell and Arthur stepped over him, his eyes searching for the next threat. The battle was over almost as soon as it began. The surprise was the total victory complete. The Hessians surrendered, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in the air. Arthur stood in the middle of the street, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline fading to leave him shaking. He looked around at his comrades, at the ragged army that had crossed a frozen river and marched through a blizzard to achieve the impossible. General Washington rode through the town, his face etched with relief and pride. And as Arthur watched him, he realized that the tide had turned. The despair of the winter was broken. They had looked death in the face on the dark waters of the Delaware, and they had not blinked. The snow was still falling, covering the dead, and the living alike in a white shroud. But the sun was rising higher, now a pale disk behind the clouds. And in its light, Arthur Sterling saw not just the morning of a new day, but the dawn of a new nation. A crimson dawn born of blood and ice, and an unshakable will to be free. The euphoria of the victory at Trenton had faded into the grim monotony of a long stalemate. The army was encamped now in the hills of Morristown, where the trees were black skeletons against the gray sky, and the mud was deep enough to swallow a man's boot hole. Arthur Sterling sat by the dying embers of a watchfire, his eyes stinging from the smoke and the lack of sleep. The night was thick and heavy, with a fog that rolled in from the valley, obscuring the tents and muffling the sounds of the sentries, until the world seemed to shrink down to a circle of dim light, a few feet wide. It was close to midnight, the witching hour, when the mind plays tricks on weary soldiers. Arthur pulled his cloak tighter against the damp chill, feeling the weight of the secret orders tucked inside his tunic. He had been promoted to a courier for the general's staff, a position of trust that carried with it a burden of constant paranoia. Rumors had been swirling through the camp like dead leaves in a gale. Rumors of a leak in the high command, of movements betrayed before they began, of supply wagons ambushed with uncanny precision. Arthur watched the flames dance and thought of the faces of the men he served with, men he had bled beside. Surely none of them could be the traitor. Surely the bond forged in the fires of Valley Ford was unbreakable. But as the church bell in the distant village tolled 12 deep, mournful notes that seemed to hang in the mist, Arthur saw a shadow move near the edge of the officers' quarters, a movement that was too stealthy for a drunkard and too deliberate for a sleepwalker. He stiffened his hand, moving instinctively to the hilt of his knife. He watched as the figure paused, looking left and right with the jerky movements of a guilty conscience, before slipping into the darkness of the woods that bordered the camp. Arthur did not call out the challenge. Instinct told him that this was the moment he had been dreading, the moment the ghost would reveal itself. He kicked snow over the fire, extinguishing the light, and moved into the trees, his footsteps silent on the damp moss, following the shadow like a hunter stalking a deer. The woods were a labyrinth of darkness, the branches reaching out like clawed hands to snag his clothes, but Arthur moved with a grim determination, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He saw the figure ahead, stopping by an old stone well that had long since run dry, a meeting place that was isolated and perfect for treachery. Arthur crouched behind a fallen log, his heart hammering against his ribs so loud he feared it would give him away. He watched as a second figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a dark cloak, but with the unmistakable polished boots of a British dragoon. The two men spoke in hushed whispers, their voices carried on the damp air. Arthur strained to hear, catching fragments of words about troop numbers, artillery positions, and the general's location. The traitor reached into his coat and pulled out a packet of papers, the seal of the Continental Army visible even in the dark. He handed it to the British agent, his hand trembling slightly. Arthur felt a cold rage flood his veins, a sensation sharper than the winter wind. He knew he had to act. He could not let those papers leave these woods. He drew his pistol, the metal cold against his palm, and stepped out from behind the log, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip crack as he ordered them to freeze. The British agent reacted instantly, spinning around and firing a shot that went wide, chipping the bark off a tree next to Arthur's head. The traitor gasped and turned his face, illuminated by the flash of the powder. Arthur felt the world drop out from under his feet. The face staring back at him was not a stranger. It was Julian, his childhood friend, the man who had stood beside him at his wedding, the man who had shared his last crust of bread at Valley Forge. The shock paralyzed Arthur for a heartbeat that the British agent used to vanish into the mist, his footsteps fading rapidly toward the British lines. Julian stood frozen, his face a mask of terror and shame, the incriminating papers still in his hand, or perhaps he had already passed them. It didn't matter. The act was done. Arthur walked forward, his pistol leveled at his friend's chest, his hand shaking now not from fear, but from a grief so profound it threatened to bring him to his knees. Julian fell to his knees in the mud, his hands raised in supplication, tears streaming down his face mixing with the dirt. He began to babble excuses, speaking of his sick wife, of the gold the British had promised, of the belief that the war was already lost and he was just trying to save his family. Arthur listened, his heart turning to stone. He remembered the men who had died in the snow, the men who had charged the cannons at Trenton, all of them betrayed for a pouch of coins and a promise of safety. "You sold us," Arthur whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You sold our souls, Julian." The traitor reached out, grasping at the hem of Arthur's coat, begging for mercy, begging for the sake of the old days. But Arthur knew that the old days were dead and killed by the same hand that had signed those stolen papers. The dilemma tore at him. He could not pull the trigger on a man he had loved like a brother, but he could not let him go to betray them again. The sound of shouting came from the camp. The gunshot had raised the alarm. Lanterns were bobbing in the distance, moving toward the woods. Julian looked at the lights and then back at Arthur, seeing the conflict in his eyes. He realized that there was no way back, no way to undo the midnight hour. In a sudden, desperate movement, Julian lunged not at Arthur, but for the knife at Arthur's belt. A struggle ensued in the mud, two friends, locked in a deadly embrace, rolling over the wet leaves and the tree roots. Arthur tried to subdue him, to capture him for trial, but Julian fought with the frantic strength of a man who has nothing left to lose. The knife slipped from its sheath, glinting in the faint moonlight. They grappled for it, breathing hard, their faces inches apart. Arthur looked into Julian's eyes and saw only madness and fear. Then there was a sharp intake of breath, a sudden stillness. Julian slumped forward, his weight heavy on Arthur. Arthur pushed him back and saw the hilt of the knife protruding from Julian's chest. A fatal wound, self-inflicted in the struggle, or perhaps a final act of cowardice to escape the hangman. Arthur sat back in the mud, his hands covered in the blood of his best friend. The silence of the woods returning to press in on him. The soldiers burst into the clearing, their lanterns banishing the shadows, revealing the tableau of tragedy. They asked what happened. They looked at the body with suspicion, but Arthur could not speak. His throat was closed tight with a lump of sorrow that he knew would never dissolve. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his breeches, leaving dark stains that merged with the dirt. He retrieved the papers from the ground, the secrets that had cost a life, and handed them to the sergeant. As they carried the body away, Arthur remained by the old well, staring into the darkness. The betrayal at midnight was over, the threat was neutralized, but something inside him had broken. A piece of his humanity had been left in the mud with Julian. He looked up at the sky, where the clouds were beginning to break, revealing a single cold star. He realized then that the fight for liberty was not just against the British. It was against the weakness of the human heart, against the shadows that lived inside them all. Arthur turned and walked back toward the camp, the weight of the war heavier than ever on his shoulders. He was a hero to the men who slapped his back and praised his vigilance. But as he lay down by the rekindled fire, he felt no pride, only a deep, hollow ache. For he knew that the dawn of liberty would be stained not just with the blood of enemies, but with the tears of betrayal. and the night seemed to stretch on forever, darker and colder than any winter he had ever known. The scorching sun of June beat down upon the parched fields of New Jersey, turning the road into a choking ribbon of dust that coated the throats of the marching men with a gritty layer of misery. But unlike the winter of despair where heads hung low and spirits were broken, Arthur Sterling walked with his spine straight and his eyes fixed on the horizon, because this was not the same army that had huddled in the snow of Valley Forge. The months of drilling under the stern gaze of Baron von Steuben had transformed the ragtag collection of farmers and shopkeepers into a disciplined fighting machine. They moved now with a rhythmic cadence, the sound of thousands of boots striking the earth in unison, a heartbeat of war that resonated through the soles of Arthur's feet. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a sleeve that was no longer tattered but patched and clean. The uniform he wore was blue and buff, the colors of the Continental Army, and wearing it felt like wearing a suit of armor not made of steel but of pride. The British were on the move, retreating from Philadelphia, marching north toward New York, and General Washington had decided that the time for hiding was over. The time had come to bite the heels of the lion, to show the world that the American eagle had finally grown its talons. Arthur rode up and down the line of his company, his voice ringing out with commands that were obeyed instantly. Gone were the days of hesitation and confusion. Now there was only the professional grimness of men who knew their trade, and that trade was war. They caught the British rearguard near Monmouth Courthouse, on a day so hot that men were fainting in the ranks from heat stroke, their muskets burning their hands. The air shimmered with waves of heat, making the distant redcoats look like a mirage, a bloody smear against the green of the orchards. The battle began not with a skirmish, but with a roar of artillery that shook the ground. Arthur dismounted and drew his sword, leading his men into the rye field where the grain stood tall and golden, ready for a harvest of death. The British grenadiers advanced with their bayonets, leveled a wall of steel and arrogance that had terrified armies across the globe. But as they closed the distance, shouting their huzzas, they found that the rebels did not run. The Americans stood their ground, forming a solid blue line that refused to break. Arthur shouted the order to fire, and a sheet of flame erupted from the American ranks. The volley was precise and devastating, tearing holes in the British line. The smoke hung heavy in the humid air, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs. But through the haze, Arthur saw the enemy falter. This was the turning point, the moment the tide began to shift, not just in this battle, but in the entire war. For the first time, the British were not fighting a mob. They were fighting an army that could stand toe-to-toe with the best soldiers in Europe. The battle raged for hours, a grueling stalemate of volleys and bayonet charges fought under a relentless sun. Arthur found himself in the thick of the melee, parrying the thrust of a British officer, his sword clashing against steel with a jarring impact. He fought with a cold, calculated fury, remembering the friends he had lost, remembering Julian's betrayal, remembering the frozen nights in the log huts. He saw General Washington riding along the lines on his white horse, heedless of the bullets buzzing around him like angry hornets. The general's presence was a talisman that banished fear, inspiring the men to push beyond their limits. As the afternoon wore on, the British attacks grew weaker, their confidence eroded by the stubborn resistance of the Continentals. And then came the news that rippled down the line like a refreshing breeze. The French had joined the war. The alliance was official. The might of France, with her gold and her ships and her soldiers, was finally committed to the cause of American liberty. Arthur felt a surge of emotion that nearly brought him to his knees. They were no longer alone. The gamble had paid off. The world had seen their struggle and had deemed it worthy of support. The British began to withdraw under the cover of darkness, slipping away toward the coast, leaving the field to the Americans. It was not a crushing victory, but it was something far more important. It was proof that they could win. Arthur stood amidst the trampled rye, the smoke clearing to reveal the carnage of the day. He was exhausted, his body bruised and dehydrated, but his spirit soared, lighter than it had been in years. He looked at the men around him, their faces blackened with powder, their uniforms stained with sweat and blood, and he saw a new light in their eyes, the light of confidence. They sat around the campfires that night, not in sullen silence, but with a quiet satisfaction, sharing their rations and telling stories of the day's exploits. Arthur wrote no letter home that night for words that seemed inadequate to describe the shift in the universe. Instead, he lay on his back looking up at the stars, which seemed to shine brighter than before. The tide had turned, the long retreat was over, the defensive war was finished. Now they would march forward, not just to survive but to conquer. He thought of the British fleet sailing away, and imagined the French sails appearing on the horizon, white clouds of hope billowing in the wind. The road to independence was still long and paved with danger, but as Arthur closed his eyes, he knew that the destination was no longer a dream but a certainty. The crimson dawn was passing, giving way to the bright, hard light of day, and in that light, the shape of a new nation was becoming clear, forged in fire, tempered in blood, and unbreakable as the iron will of the men who slept in the fields of Monmouth, ready to wake and finish what they had started. The October rain fell in a ceaseless, drizzling curtain that turned the Virginia soil into a thick, sucking clay that clung to boots and wheels alike. But even the gloom of the weather could not dampen the electric sense of anticipation that crackled through the American lines. Arthur Sterling crouched in the muddy trench, his uniform now a patchwork of repairs that told the story of 6 long years of war, his hands gripping the cold steel of his musket, which tonight would remain silent until the very last moment. It was the 14th of October, 1781, and the siege of Yorktown had reached its crescendo. For weeks, the combined artillery of the French and American armies had pounded the British defenses into a cratered wasteland, the ground shaking with a rhythmic thunder that never ceased day or night, denying the enemy sleep or safety. Arthur looked up at the sky, where the heavy clouds obscured the moon and stars, providing the cloak of darkness they so desperately needed for the night's work. He was part of the select detachment chosen for the assault on Redoubt No. 10, one of the 2 final earthen forts that blocked the completion of the second siege parallel and stood between Washington's army and total victory. General Alexander Hamilton was to lead the charge, a man whose ambition burned as brightly as his courage, and the order had been passed down the line with a terrifying simplicity: unload your weapons, fix bayonets, tonight we fight with steel alone. Arthur felt a strange calm settle over him, a clarity that often came before the storm. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, from the tea-stained waters of Boston Harbor to the frozen hell of Valley Forge and the scorching fields of Monmouth. Every step, every loss, every drop of blood had led to this singular point in time. Beside him stood men he had known for years, their faces gaunt and shadowed under their tricorn hats, but their eyes alive with a fierce resolve. They knew as he did that if they took these redoubts, Cornwallis would be finished, trapped with his back to the river and nowhere to run. The signal came not with a trumpet blast, but with a whispered command that rippled through the ranks like a breeze through dry grass, up and forward. Arthur climbed out of the trench with his boots slipping on the wet earth and joined the column of ghosts moving silently through the darkness toward the looming shape of the British fortification. The French were attacking Redoubt No. 9 to their left, and Arthur could sense their movement in the dark, a brotherly presence that bolstered his courage. But his focus was locked on the abattis, ahead, the jagged wall of felled trees, with sharpened branches meant to impale any attacker. The sappers went first to the brave engineers, whose job was to hack a path through the wood, with axes while exposed to enemy fire. The sound of their axes biting into the timber seemed deafeningly loud in the silence, but the British sentries remained unaware until the very last second. Suddenly, a voice cried out from the ramparts. A challenge in English followed immediately by the flash of a musket and the whistle of a ball passing harmlessly overhead. The element of surprise was broken, and the night exploded into chaos. The British opened fire, a ragged volley that lit up the darkness with flashes of orange and yellow. Men around him fell with wet thuds, but the column did not stop, it did not waver. They surged forward with a roar that had been building in their throats since 1776. Arthur scrambled over the remnants of the abattis, the sharp wood tearing at his uniform and scratching his skin, but he felt no pain, only the driving need to reach the parapet. He saw Hamilton vaulting over the wall, his sword drawn leading from the front, and Arthur followed his heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. They poured into the redoubt like a tidal wave of blue steel. The fighting was brutal and intimate hand to hand in the confined space of the earthworks. There was no time to reload, no time to aim. It was the visceral thrust of the bayonet and the clubbing blow of the musket butt. Arthur found himself face to face with a British grenadier, a towering man with fear in his eyes. Arthur parried the man's thrust and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him back against a sandbag. The grenadier raised his hands in surrender, and Arthur stepped back his chest, heaving his breath coming in ragged gasps. All around him, the British were throwing down their arms, realizing that they were overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the American assault. The fight had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had felt like a lifetime. A cheer went up from the darkness, a raw primal sound of victory that was echoed moments later by the French from Redoubt No. 9. They had done it. The key to Yorktown was in their hands. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of the victory began to sink in. Arthur looked out from the top of the captured fort toward the town of Yorktown, where the British army lay trapped. He could see the lights of their campfires flickering in the distance, lights that looked fragile and doomed. The next few days were a blur of activity, as the Allies moved their heavy guns into the captured redoubts, turning the British-owned defenses against them. The bombardment that followed was a terrifying display of power, the ground shaking so violently that it felt as if the world itself was cracking open. Arthur watched from the trenches as the shells arched through the sky like fiery meteors crashing into the town, with devastating effect. He saw a British ship in the harbor set, ablaze, its burning hull painting the water with reflections of blood and fire. On the night of the 16th, a violent storm swept in from the river, the wind howling like a banshee, and the rain lashing down in sheets. Rumors spread that Cornwallis had tried to escape across the river to Gloucester Point, but the storm had scattered his boats, destroying his last hope of salvation. Arthur huddled under a canvas tarp, listening to the wind, and knew that the end was near. The elements themselves seemed to be fighting for American independence. Then came the morning of the 17th. The guns fell silent one by one, until a strange ringing quiet descended over the battlefield. A quiet so profound that men stopped what they were doing and looked at each other in disbelief. Arthur stood up in the trench, peering over the parapet, and saw a sight that made his heart stop. A lone drummer boy in a red coat stood on the British rampart beating a parley, a rhythm that signaled a request to talk, and beside him an officer waving a white handkerchief. A roar began low in the throats of the American soldiers and swelled until it shook the very air, a sound of relief and triumph that brought tears to Arthur's eyes. The negotiations took 2 days of agonizing waiting where time seemed to stand still, but finally the terms were agreed upon. The 19th of October dawned bright and clear, the autumn sun bathing the fields in a golden light that seemed to promise a new beginning. Arthur stood in formation with his regiment, his uniform brushed clean, his bayonet gleaming in the sun. Opposite them stood the French army in their pristine white uniforms, their flags snapping in the breeze. They formed a long lane, a corridor of victors leading to the surrender field. The British army marched out their heads, bowed their flags, furled their music, playing a melancholic tune that Arthur recognized as the world turned upside down. A fitting anthem for a day when the impossible had become reality. He watched them pass, the soldiers of the world's greatest empire, humbled by a collection of farmers and tradesmen who had refused to yield. Cornwallis did not appear, pleading illness, sending his second-in-command General O'Hara instead. Arthur watched as O'Hara tried to offer his sword to the French General Rochambeau, who simply pointed toward General Washington, and then Washington, with a grace that defined the man, pointed toward his own second-in-command General Lincoln. It was a moment of perfect poetic justice. As the British soldiers piled their muskets into a heap, the clatter of wood and steel sounded like the breaking of chains. Arthur felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight he had carried for 6 years. He looked down at his own hands that were scarred and calloused hands that had held a printer's type and a soldier's musket, and he knew that they would soon be building a new country. He thought of Julian and the others who had not lived to see this day, and whispered a silent promise that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The final charge had been made, the last battle fought and won, and as Arthur Sterling looked up at the American flag, waving proudly above the ramparts of Yorktown, he saw not just a piece of cloth, but the fabric of a future that belonged to them, a future free and bright as the sun that now stood high in the noonday sky. The long night was over. The United States of America was born. The silence that settled over the land in the wake of the Treaty of Paris was not the empty silence of desolation that had haunted the winter fields of Valley Forge, nor was it the tense, breathless silence that precedes the roar of a cannon volley. It was a living, breathing silence filled with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of wind through the cornfields, a silence that tasted of peace and of a future that was finally theirs to shape. Arthur Sterling stood outside France's Tavern in New York City, the sounds of the farewell dinner still echoing in his mind. He had just witnessed General Washington bid farewell to his officers, a scene of such raw emotion that tears had streamed down the faces of hardened men who had stared death in the eye without blinking. The commander-in-chief, the man who had been the rock upon which the revolution was built, had simply raised his glass and said, with a voice trembling with feeling, that he wished them full of health and happiness. And then one by one he had embraced them. It was the end of an era, the disbanding of the brotherhood of arms that had forged a nation out of chaos. Arthur turned his collar up against the chill of early December, but this time the cold did not bite deep, for there was a warmth in his chest that no weather could extinguish, the warmth of going home. He began the long walk north toward Boston, his musket slung over his shoulder, not as a weapon of war, but as a keepsake of a time that was already beginning to feel like a legend. The road was long, but his step was light. He passed through towns that were rebuilding, where the scars of cannon fire were being covered by fresh timber and new paint. He saw farmers working in the fields without fear, their eyes no longer scanning the horizon for the red coats of the enemy, but watching the clouds for signs of rain. In a tavern in Connecticut, he sat by the fire and listened to men arguing about taxes and representation and the new constitution that was being debated. And he smiled into his ale, realizing that this was exactly what they had fought for. Not for the agreement of all, but for the right to disagree without fear of the hangman. The journey took weeks of slow decompression, from the vigilance of a soldier to the rhythm of a citizen. Arthur slept in barns, and under the stars, watching the constellations wheel overhead, the same stars that had looked down on their suffering, now shining with a pristine clarity. As he crossed the border into Massachusetts, the air seemed to change, carrying the familiar scent of the sea and the pine forests of his youth. He reached the outskirts of Boston on a Tuesday afternoon, the city bustling with a renewed energy, the harbor forest of masts thicker than ever, ships from France and Spain and Holland unloading goods that were no longer taxed by a foreign king. Arthur walked through the winding streets, his heart hammering against his ribs, a different kind of pounding than the terror of battle. It was the terrifying hope of reunion. He turned the corner onto his street, and there it was, the small wooden house with the peeling paint and the smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It looked exactly the same, and yet completely different, for now it was a house in a free country. He paused at the gate, his hand resting on the latch, suddenly afraid that perhaps he was a ghost returning to a life that had moved on without him. 8 years was a lifetime. A boy had become a man. A young wife had become a matriarch. He pushed the gate open, the hinges groaning with a familiar sound, and walked up the path, his boots crunching on the gravel. The door opened before he could knock, and Eliza stood there, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the worry of the years, but her eyes, Those blue eyes that he had carried in his memory through every dark night were unchanged. She stared at him for a long moment, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob, and then she was in his arms. The embrace was fierce and desperate, a collapsing of the years into a single moment of connection. They stood on the doorstep, weeping openly, holding onto each other, as if to prove that they were real, that this was not another dream born of longing. A tall young man appeared in the hallway behind her, holding a book. Arthur looked up and saw his son Thomas, now taller than himself. His shoulders broad, his face a mixture of shock and dawning recognition. Arthur reached out and pulled him into the embrace. The family made whole again, the circle closed. That night they sat by the fire, not speaking much, for words were too small to hold the enormity of the moment. They simply sat in the presence of each other, listening to the crackle of the logs and the wind outside, a wind that no longer sounded like a threat. In the days that followed, Arthur returned to his printing press, cleaning the dust from the type and oiling the gears. The first thing he printed was not a political pamphlet or a news sheet, but a copy of the Declaration of Independence. He set the type letter by letter, feeling the weight of the words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. He placed the fresh page on the drying rack, the ink glistening wet and black, and looked at it with a sense of profound satisfaction. This was his weapon now, the press, the voice of the people, the guardian of the liberty they had won with blood. Life settled into a new rhythm of work and family and civic duty. There were struggles, of course, for the new nation. It was like a child learning to walk, stumbling and falling, but always getting back up. There were debts to be paid and political battles to be fought, but they were the battles of free men. One morning, months later, Arthur woke before dawn and walked down to the harbor. He stood on Griffin's Wharf, the very spot where they had thrown the tea into the sea so many years ago. The water was calm, glassy and dark, reflecting the fading stars. He thought of Julian and the betrayal in the woods. He thought of the boy William who had died in the snow at Valley Forge. He thought of the thousands who lay in unmarked graves across the colonies. They were the price of this morning, the currency with which this peace had been bought. As he stood there, the eastern sky began to lighten, the deep indigo turning to a soft violet, and then a burning crimson. The sun crested the horizon, a ball of fire rising from the ocean, painting the water in shades of gold and blood. It was a new day, a new year, a new age. Arthur took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, salt air, and felt a sense of infinite possibility. The war was over. The past was a story to be told, but the future was a blank page waiting to be written. He turned away from the water and walked back toward the city that was waking up around him. The church bells began to ring, a joyous sound that rolled over the rooftops, and Arthur Sterling, citizen of the United States of America, walked home under the light of the new nation's sunrise, ready to live the life he had fought so hard to save, knowing that as long as men were willing to stand for it, the sun would never set on the liberty they had found.